Hello, everyone. This is your formal welcome to the webinar. Welcome. I'm Stuart Astill, your chair or host or convener, whatever we might want to call it, for today's CECAN webinar. Some of you here I've seen on the attendee list, people that know me already, but for those of you that don't, because there's a lot of people here today, I'm a founder member of the original CECAN project and a non-executive director of CECAN Limited, which is our spin-off company, which came out of CECAN at the University of Surrey. So I do consulting, I do training and coaching with CECAN and independently, and we do that on a whole range of issues around strategy and evidence with a focus on complexity, and I happen to specialise in value for money analysis. So I'm really pleased to be hosting this today. Jess and Maddie's work is absolutely great, and I don't feel ashamed to say that I've already lifted or stolen, if you prefer, various turns of phrase and ideas from it already and used it in my work. So I'm sure that everybody else will get the benefit of that as well. For those of you who haven't joined us before, a quick introduction to CECAN. So CECAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. The Nexus is the food, energy, water and environmental domains. But in fact, we've moved into many other policy areas linked to complexity, and we've moved into policy analysis as well as evaluation. But we were originally set up as a ESRC funded research centre to transform the practice of policy evaluation in those Nexus areas. And CECAN works through pioneering, testing and promoting innovative policy evaluation approaches with UK government departments largely, who were kindly originally part of our funding stream. And we continue to work with many UK government departments through CECAN Limited now in consulting and training. And if you want to know more about CECAN, if you want to know more about CECAN in consulting or CECAN as the academic network, then visit cecan.ac.uk and cecan.co.uk, where you can find lots more information on the cecan.ac.uk site, the academic site. You can find today's webinar will be up there eventually, and there's plenty of other webinars and resources and links to things that you'll find really interesting. So today's webinar specifically has a title that I think pretty much says it all, if we can say it all, because it's quite long, but it does say it all: Navigating Systems Change Evaluation, Reflections on How to Know You're Making Progress in Shifting Systems. And I think we can all gain, if we work hard enough, the skills to analyse systems change, but I think evaluating is a different matter. And when we have drawn our conclusions, how do we put our findings into suitable context when we're operating in a shifting and sensitive complex system? And I think that there's a lot of things to address around that. And the paper that Jess and Maddie have produced that you might have already had a chance to look at is really insightful. And I also find it very practical. And I'm sure that today's webinar will deliver more of the same. So we're really delighted to have Madeline, I think I've said that right, Madeline, Goldie and Jessica Davies here presenting the webinar today. And Maddie and Jess are both at the not-for-profit, which is called Social Finance, and they work with a range of organisations designing, developing, implementing and importantly embedding systems change. Their projects range from what I would call systemically abstract, such as the world of local authorities commissioning and investment approaches, through to concrete contexts like rolling out digital tools to support children's social care. So I think that there's a whole range of contexts there that should be something for everybody and always something really relevant. So I think we're ready to go. Yes, and you can submit your questions at any point via the question box, which is labelled Q&A on your menu bar. So that's the way to submit the questions. And then we'll take them all at the end in a Q&A, but we're going to have the webinar go through and then we'll take the Q&A points at the end. And just to say that the session will be recorded, and as I said, it'll be made available later on the CECAN website with the slides that you're seeing, so you'll get access to those slides as well. So now I'll hand over to Jess for the presentation, and then you'll get the Q&A session afterwards. So please do submit your questions as we go along. Jess, thank you.
Thank you, Stuart, and thanks so much for having us. The admiration goes both ways. We found your work really useful when we were doing the research behind this, in particular the annex to the Magenta book. So it's an honour to be invited to contribute today. So thanks. So we'll do brief intros to the two of us, and then a little bit of an outline of kind of the background for this work, why we ended up doing it, and what we'll go through today, and then jump into the content. So I'm Jessica Davies. I'm an Associate Director at Social Finance in our Impact Incubator team. SF was set up back in 2007, initially with a focus on sort of changing the financial and funding system to try to promote a greater link to social outcomes. And that's broadened over time to encompass a much wider range of different ways to try to make systemic change and bring about outcomes and impact at scale. And within that, the Impact Incubator team, where I sit, works specifically in partnership with philanthropic foundations to really take a system change approach from the ground up. So we go from actually deciding which issues to work on through to building and implementing systems change approaches, which can look very different depending on the issue, and then kind of driving that forward. So that's sort of who I am and where I sit. Maddie?
So my name's Maddie Goldie. As Stuart said, I am a manager in our government enterprise team at Social Finance. And I am a little bit slightly different focus to Jess's work in the Impact Incubator. Tend to work a little bit more on projects with our statutory sector partners, so central, local, regional government, thinking about how government can be a leader, funder, facilitator of system change across various different policy domains. So that might, in some cases, that's looked like new community-led commissioning models, or helping governments think about how to facilitate coordination between services more effectively, through to utilising innovative financing and social investment tools for place-based policy making. So coming into this topic of how we evaluate system change efforts with slightly more of that government lens.
And the background to kind of how we spent a good, probably in the end, 18 months all told on this focus on kind of navigating system change evaluation. As I said, the sort of DNA of social finance is really thinking about change at scale and in terms of systems. And we spent some time a few years ago thinking about what our kind of methodologies or approaches were to trying to make impact at scale. And I guess the kind of key conclusion of that was partly that you need to think and act in terms of systems. So that's the work that we wrote and published in our Roots to Scale report back in 2021, where we really set out kind of what we mean by impact at scale and kind of big end goal shifts in systems, how you kind of define those end goals, and produce a framework for kind of mapping potential routes to drive that kind of change forward. And we were aware throughout that work that there was this kind of huge question buzzing around at the edges around, well, how do you actually evaluate those efforts? If this is a way of kind of building strategies and thinking about how to structure, how to do that work, how are you going to go and actually, figure out whether you're making progress against it? And as we've sort of seen the conversation, at least in the world that we live in and the partners we're working with, develop to sort of greater interest to systems type approaches, we've also seen alongside that, growing kind of sense of importance of how, okay, if we're funding this stuff, how are we going to actually figure out if it's working? So back in 2022, we connected up with the System Innovation Initiative, then based out of the Rockwell Foundation, now independent, to think about and kind of devote some time to really thinking about how folks are approaching this question of evaluating systems change and what the implications might be. And we set out really to kind of produce something practical, as Stuart said, so I'm glad that that comes through. We're practitioners, that we're working with partners trying to kind of make this stuff happen. And so we spent time having a broad range of conversation with folks across the kind of funder, commissioner space, through to kind of innovators and practitioners of systems change, through to those who are really kind of developing the evaluation practice around it. And what we wanted to kind of produce out at the end of that was something that would help people kind of figure out how to kind of get their teeth into it as a topic and approach it. So we're not trying to make an academic contribution. I know there are those of you who are really steeped in the academics of this on the call, but we were kind of trying from the perspective of practitioners to understand the problem, the practices, and produce something that would help others to navigate that, as well as others in our own organisation. And so what we'll run through today, we'll spend a little bit of time, not too long, on why our kind of summary of why evaluating system change is hard. I think that's something familiar to everybody. So we won't dwell too long on that, but we wanted to kind of find a way of summarising that would be helpful to those for whom this is a newer space. Then we'll talk a bit about how we suggest that evaluation needs to adapt to work in that context. So both things that we think need to look different, but also what we think the kind of core foundations are that should stay the same. Then we'll talk about our sort of summary of how systems change evaluation approaches might kind of look in practice. And finally, we'll share a few reflections on our thoughts about what you might actually be trying to look for evidence of, and what the changes might be that you're seeking. And I guess just kind of one final overarching reflection. when we set out on the work, we kind of didn't know, we're relatively new to it, other than our interaction with it in kind of practice. And what we had a sense of from some of the people we were talking to was this kind of desire to find that, that there was a huge gap around systems change evaluation, and no one knew how to do it, and maybe we'd have to dream up some new methodologies. And I think what became very quickly obvious to us was that actually that's not the case. It's a really thriving area of work. There's loads of really interesting stuff out there, lots of approaches and methodologies, but clearly that didn't seem to be kind of translating to the conversations we were having or the people we were working with. And so what we set out to do was to try to write something that would provide some framing, a kind of common language and an accessible way to sort of navigate the issue and understand, almost to kind of break down the mystique around it and sort of get to grips with it. So that's sort of what we're trying to do, just to give you a sense of where we think it sits. So with that, I'll hand to Maddie.
Thanks, Jess. So yeah, we'll speak a little bit about what we heard when we were speaking to funders, commissioners, practitioners, evaluators about system change evaluation. We'll speak a little bit about what we heard was really, really hard about using evaluation methods for system change efforts. But as Jess said, we'll kind of expect that many of you on the call or listening will sort of have your own experience of why it's difficult, and we can sort of take some of it as read, but perhaps it would be interesting for us to share sort of what the most common things are that we heard from those we interviewed. So perhaps unsurprisingly, one of the big things that we heard from almost everyone we spoke to was that systems don't change fast. At least they're not going to change on the ordinary timescales of a funding round or of a term in political office, and that the timescales that we're usually talking about when it comes to significant social change are more likely to be in the realm of decades. And actually, we came across some research that Harvard Business School study that showed that the most significant social change efforts over the last sort of century have taken close. I think the average was about 25 years. We're talking about things like anti-apartheid, marriage equality, free public libraries, seatbelts, all of these things that we think of as really significant change efforts weren't demonstrating sort of those change outcomes within the first 2 years of that work. And that pressure to demonstrate impact within a short time frame, which is often sort of a reasonable desire to check that what you're doing is working, causes, I guess, a tension between wanting to have the patience and the time to really demonstrate, make lasting changes with the need to be accountable for what you're doing and the resources you're using in the short term. Related to that, we heard from people very often that one of the big challenges for evaluation in this space is that the outcomes that we're seeking are often what we call emergent. And as such, system change efforts are often focused not so much on achieving really sort of specific outcomes, perhaps at the level of a particular population. Often people talked about what they were doing in terms of creating the conditions for change to emerge, or perhaps they thought of themselves as pulling multiple levers in the system at once, not knowing what might shift first, or not necessarily having a model in their mind of these sequential steps that would happen in order to unleash an outcome. And basically what that comes down to is that it's very hard to predict when or what a change will be in a system. If we think about things like the collapse of the Berlin Wall or the 2008 market crash, these are things that completely changed these enormous systems, and people days before these events happened, you would have been hard pressed to find someone able to predict that was about to happen. And so I guess perhaps we heard from practitioners, from evaluators, that they more were thinking about maybe the stew of ingredients that they were creating for change. I guess, yeah, this might come down to like a range of things. It might look like changing the way legislators understood an issue. It might look like developing an evidence base, developing new standards for best practice in a particular service. It might look like shifting the way people talk about problems and the way we frame them. But all of these things sort of coming together to build up pressure so that when a spark is lit or a window opens for opportunity, that's when the change will emerge. Obviously, if you think about that from the perspective of a funder or an evaluator trying to monitor how much progress is being made, perhaps you'll be hard pressed to demonstrate the extent to which you've made progress against that goal in a linear way. And the third thing that we just wanted to highlight that we heard a lot that makes evaluation hard in this space is that, and this again won't come as a surprise to anyone, I'm sure, but that causal relationships tend to be quite foggy in complex systems. And that comes down, I guess, in many respects to just the sheer volume of interactions, factors, actors, entities that are moving together in a system. That make it very difficult to sort of spot a clear, bright causal pathway between what you're doing, the action you're taking, and the outcome you're seeking to affect. It would be hard, for example, to attribute marriage equality to the specific actions of a advocacy organization in that space, even if you could say and demonstrate that that organization was instrumental, very influential. It would be hard to prove that it was the causal variable that created marriage equality in the UK. I guess, where this poses challenges for evaluation, we think perhaps is more about an attitude to evaluation than evaluation as a practice. And I guess we felt that where funders are expecting or used to perhaps seeing randomized control trials that create point estimates and sort of what some people refer to as a gold standard of proof of causation, they're able to attribute this intervention to that outcome. There might need to be a sort of change in expectation about what system evaluation can actually deliver, rather than getting to those point estimates that maybe we might be used to when we think about evaluation. I guess we heard that there might need to be different expectations around evaluation, delivering best guesses, more iterative hypotheses, new questions, and certainly when it comes to causation, thinking more about the way that an effort is contributing to an outcome rather than being solely attributed to a particular outcome. So I'll talk now a little bit. We'll move in now to spending a bit of time on what we think as a result of these challenges, what should evaluation do differently, and what might need to stay the same? How can evaluation respond to these challenges? So as I've just spoken a little bit about, rather than seeking new methodologies, which as Jess said, I think is something that perhaps we had in our mind as we set out on this work, that we would be thinking, we'd be learning about new methodologies to prove impact in a complex social system. I guess we've reflected a little bit more about the ways in which evaluate the answer, if there is an answer to how to evaluate systems and system change. Perhaps it lies more in reframing what we expect from evaluation. Not at all to lower our standards of what evaluation can and should do, but rather to almost make it work harder and make us work harder to think about what evaluation is telling us about our impact. And certainly, despite the challenges that system change work poses to evaluation, I think, it goes without saying that we think evaluation remains one of the most powerful engines we have for driving forward an effort and driving forward change. You can't make progress unless you're checking for impact. And I guess sort of coming into this space, we came across very loosely maybe two schools of thought that were approaching this challenge of evaluation in system change contexts quite differently. And I guess what we want to present here is the idea that both of these perspectives that we came across were responding to challenges that they saw in the evaluation space. Both of them were touching on elements that were really important for system change evaluation. And I guess we want to argue that we should take from both of these schools of thought some really important insights about how evaluation might need to look different, while not necessarily moving too far away from some of the core foundations of evaluation. So I'm just going to speak now to 3 or 4 of the things that we think might need to look quite different in the world of system change evaluation. I'm just going to move our slides forward as well while I speak a little bit about this sort of sense of the spectrum, the left-hand side of the spectrum versus the right-hand side of the spectrum here. So on one end of the spectrum, we heard from some of the folks that we spoke to that there was a bit of a temptation to depart from what we want to call like the world of objective causal proof of impact. We heard from many folks who were rightly pointing out the difficulty of achieving proof of impact in the system change context. They were embracing collective learning as a guiding star and really thinking about how can we make sure that the evaluation efforts in this context are primarily about generating new insights and facilitating learning between stakeholders around a table to a system change effort. We saw in this group a really strong recognition of the need for system change evaluation to become more adaptive, more flexible, and more open to getting its hands dirty in the sense of informing strategy, shaping the effort from the inside. So 4 things specifically that we think we want to take forward from this school of thought. The first is about respecting the black box. And I guess what we mean by the black box here is the space into which our efforts go into in a system change effort that then spit out an outcome. Given how we've just spoken about how hard it is to unpick causality in a complex system, inevitably, it is true from this way of thinking that funders and commissioners will invariably have to give up some certainty about conclusive proof that a given intervention has caused a specific outcome. So in practice, this might look like tolerating lower levels of certainty about what made the difference in a particular effort, accepting multiple possible explanations, and also accepting that it's going to be packages of factors and variables together that create an impact. We also take from this camp something about embracing embedded evaluation. This is a little bit more obvious and certainly already happening in practice in a lot of places. But I guess we saw here, we really want to take away from this way of thinking that, yeah, evaluation might need to get its hands dirty. We might need to have evaluators embedded inside a system change effort on the ground, doing the work, making strategic decisions along with the leadership team as it goes. And I'll touch on the last 2 a little bit quickly because I think we're running a little bit over time, but I want to speak a little bit about something that we think is really important from this side of the spectrum, and that is orienting the system change work that you are evaluating in the wider system. We definitely, we heard from folks that we spoke to that often there is a bit of a tension between evaluating really specifically the effort that you are funding, particularly if you think about this from the perspective of a funder or commissioner. They're interested in knowing what is the impact of the work that I am facilitating, but that actually in system change work, more often than not, your effort is part of a constellation of efforts that all have the same goal, and that just thinking about your particular program or effort in isolation of others doing the same thing tends to misattribute potentially outcomes to that effort that are actually created by a combination of factors, an advocacy organization and a service organization, and perhaps a group of supportive bystanders from other organizations, from statutory sector, private sector, third sector partners, perhaps all coming together to deliver an outcome. And then finally, I just wanted we want to potentially provocatively throw in something from this side of the spectrum that we've labeled here something about considering the quality of inputs. And we certainly don't mean this to say to give up on outcomes or to shift a focus back to inputs as being something that tells you about the impact of your work. It doesn't. However, we thought it was interesting to think about the ways in which partly due to how long-term system change efforts can be, sometimes there is a need to look for how well set up a particular effort is to achieve its goals. And the metaphor that we came across here that feels quite relevant is to think about a cancer lab that is working on a cure for cancer, and it might be working on this for many decades without finding a cure. And it might even have very little to show that it is even close to finding a cure for cancer. But despite that, most people wouldn't necessarily think that that means that the lab is a failure. It's not necessarily useful to say that we shouldn't continue to fund the effort to cure cancer just because we have no evidence that we're close. Instead, you might look to some of the ingredients that have set up the lab to know whether or not you should keep funding it. You might look to the adherence of the lab to the scientific method. You might look to the quality of its leadership. You might look to the caliber of its researchers. You might look to its ability to learn and adapt. Yeah, all of these things, I think we could argue that there are similar things that you could look to in a system change effort. How well is the effort set up to learn from itself, to adapt from the evidence that it's generating about its impact? how well set up is the leadership to change the entire shape of the work that they're doing based on the evidence that an evaluation might generate. And so we want to take from this side also something about looking to those indicators for success in the absence of seeing those longer term outcomes. I'm going to hand out to Jess, who's going to speak about the other side of the spectrum and perhaps some of the things that we might expect to stay the same in system change evaluation.
So we said that we thought that there's this combination of the kind of what we were seeing among some people, a real kind of enthusiasm for this need for like a new world, a new evaluation paradigm, and also, you know, among some practitioners, quite a lot of freedom to experiment with that, perhaps particularly in the kind of philanthropic space. But then among others, and particularly for government, where actually the focus on really checking whether you're having any kind of impact, the need to, you know, be accountable for the spending of public money are felt very keenly. There's you know, less freedom to kind of jump into something which is letting go of a focus on impact, and rightly we think that that instinct is correct, because it's of course essentially the drive to find as rigorous and kind of scientific an understanding of what's working as possible. And we think that instinct is right, and that is the evaluative instinct, and it needs to remain in any kind of version of evaluation that's happening in a systems change context. So you know, we're slightly kind of characterizing here because we found that quite helpful, but there are things that we think need to be kind of retained from what I suppose people are used to recognizing as kind of classic approaches to evaluation. And we named 3 of them in particular. So the first of those is direction towards specific results. And I guess, you know, we're used to the idea that evaluators are there to really focus on checking for evidence of the impact of work, and based on kind of outcomes and a sense of what we think success will be, that we've agreed at the outset and stays the same. And we know that there are risks in a kind of systems change context, in terms of, you know, it's very dynamic, it's unstable, there are kind of interacting complex components and emergence to deal with, and greater uncertainty. I apologise if there is crying in the background. I think my daughter's just been brought in, but I'll stay focused. So within that, there can be a bit of a risk to kind of say, well, we can't set out at the start what our you know, impact is going to look like, and perhaps we just need to focus on kind of learning as we go, and really focus on a kind of learning cycle. And we've seen, you know, there are those working in the systems change evaluation context who kind of really put that in the foreground. We think that that's important, but that the instinct to really kind of check for intended impact needs to stay, and to give that direction towards learning. So while, you know, the work may be long term, those goals might be quite a long way in the future, the road to get there might be a kind of twisting and complex one. It's really important to be clear and to set some kind of goals, and we'll talk in a little bit about kind of ways of conceiving of those that we think are appropriate to systems change context. But that's important to make sure that you know, either you're not risking kind of confusing activities that are actually instrumental to your end goal, but you kind of get obsessed with focusing on those, or by work that might be good in other ways and producing interesting and kind of good outcomes, but not necessarily the ones that you're intended. So that kind of focus and retaining that sense of direction, including for the learning, and you know, that would apply in the cancer lab example as well, that, you know, just learning about anything or everything that might be possibly, you know, relevant towards the work around cancer wouldn't be the right end, but something that learning that's happening that's kind of focusing towards the things that might make the difference is right. So that's the first of them. The second thing that we say is core to all evaluation, and therefore equally core in the context of systems change, is basically a set of standards for rigorous inquiry. And I guess this is really about, you know, we spent quite a lot of time talking about what exactly is evaluation, and lifting a definition. It's obviously about seeking to make judgments of merit or worth by combining evidence and values through systematic process. And we think that definition is right, including in a system change context. So that kind of drive towards rigor, and for want of a better you know, description, the kind of scientific method, the principles of the scientific method remain really important. And I guess what we're trying to do is to say that it's not that those standards of rigor are kind of inherent within certain methodological approaches that you've then got to do, but actually to think about what the principles are behind why we point at RCTs, for example, as the gold standard, to kind of be familiar with those principles and then look for ways for those principles to be respected and part of an evaluation effort, which may not be able to draw on those experimental approaches, but we can still kind of strive for that level of, for high levels of rigor. And there are lots of kind of expressions of those principles in the literature. We kind of drew together a list of the ones that we found helpful. Thanks, Maddie. And what we try to do in the report is set out kind of what we've called these, what they kind of might look like conventionally or in the sort of evaluative context that people are more used to, and then how they might look a little bit different or need to be expanded or kind of thought about appearing in slightly different guises in the systems change evaluation context. So just to pick up a couple, the first one around transparency of reasoning, we might be used in a kind of more classic sort of project program evaluation to see a fully articulated set of hypotheses, the kind of full theory of change written out, and a scope of evaluation that's based on that and kind of fixed and held constant from, before the project is put into place through to the end of it. Whereas in a systems change context, that theory of change is not just a theory of change, but a theory of system change. It needs to kind of include definitions of the system, the boundaries of the system, what the different kind of variables around the intervention you're making might be, and what those hypotheses of change are in the system. So it's a sort of different shape of theory of change that you're looking at. And also it might need to be updated over time as the kind of approach changes, as data and information comes back. And so the scope might evolve. So it looks a little bit different potentially in a systems change context. Or similarly, as Maddie was just saying, kind of seeking independence, which we said we call sort of reflexivity and limiting bias here. You might sort of be used to seeing the kind of evaluator completely independent of the team, kind of, on the outside of it, and have a kind of see that as important in giving the confidence for objective findings. Whereas in a systems change context, you might see that evaluator sort of more embedded in the team, a sort of more developmental evaluation approach. And there may be more challenges in people kind of agreeing on their ability to find objective answers, whereas actually it looks more like sort of an awareness and a surfacing of potential sources of bias and of different perspectives, and kind of trying to bring those together in a kind of shared interpretation. So we say that those standards of rigor should also be central in evaluation of systems change work, but that it might be helpful for those approaching it to kind of have in mind that they might look a different kind of shape to what they're used to. And then the final thing that we say is important is to retain the kind of importance and the role of the evaluator in mediating between different views, particularly of different value sets. And in a way, this is sort of could be true of any evaluative work, but I think particularly in system change, where you have a huge range of different actors, you also have different kind of value sets and different views on what success looks like, what can be interpreted from evidence, what evidence should be counted. And it can be tempting, and sometimes we've seen this in sort of discussions, to sort of give up on synthesizing or reconciling those points and just kind of say that there's this beautiful pluralism. But I think there is a risk with that either you don't know how to move forward because there's no way to kind of draw the conclusions about what direction you're going or whether you're making progress, or else you just have the kind of loudest voice winning through. And so we think there is a need for evaluators to kind of enable deliberation of those different sets of values, to draw out different views and to find and provide a kind of space, an interpretative space, along with a shared language and kind of agreed parameters to discuss and debate different perspectives. And that the role of the evaluator is to really kind of, if there are different ones, to surface them, to identify where there are genuine points of difference, where actually the conclusion might be that different people involved in an effort might actually be driving slightly different, have different views of what they want to achieve, versus where perhaps they've got different views on the way to get there, but actually the goal is the same. And to do that work of kind of creating a space to have that discussion. I know Emily Gates, who I think has spoken in your webinar before, and we also spoke to, put it really nicely. She talks about it's not the role of the evaluator to select the best option, but to support the process by seeking to understand the consequences of different differing value interpretations, setting these out and encouraging generative deliberation. And kind of she recognises, and we see this too, that that's perhaps a bit of an expansion of the evaluator's role beyond what might typically be recognised, but remains really important to kind of hold that space for a kind of joint deliberation and a kind of objective discussion, I guess. And so just to sort of wrap up, I think, and kind of zooming out to that kind of meta reflection we had around what we thought we might find and what we did find, I think one of our conclusions from this was that some of the desire of those we're speaking to was to kind of find the magical holy grail methodology, which would give them the sort of certainty and quality of evidence and answers that they're used to from an RCT in a systems change context. And that actually that's a red herring. That isn't something that you're going to find. But what people need to do when approaching systems change evaluation is to shift their expectations and kind of engage more actively in what evaluation is about, what it's trying to achieve, and kind of start a little bit more from the ground up rather than expecting to find kind of off-the-shelf methodologies that are going to tick the evaluation box. Over to you, Maddie.
Thanks, Jess. So I guess, yeah, with what you've just said in mind about sort of thinking where we've landed on this work, I guess, is a recognition that evaluation can't sort of, magically solve these problems of trying to demonstrate impact in a complex space. But we wanted to kind of summarize what we've reflected on here in some perhaps guidelines when thinking about, particularly at the point in an effort where you are, or the point in any sort of journey around system change, when you are framing an evaluation, thinking about commissioning evaluation or funding work and thinking about what you're going to expect of those you are funding around what they will report to you on evaluation. We wanted to summarize what our findings were here in 5, sort of a checklist of 5 things, and I'll touch on them fairly quickly in the interests of leaving plenty of time for questions at the end. But those things are, first of all, embedding evaluative thinking into strategic planning and really expecting that in system change work that your evaluation will be sort of in the tent, as it were, and less arm's length. And there are plenty of different ways to do this. It could be seeing an evaluation and learning lead hired into the team. It could be designing sort of a learning process in partnership with your evaluation, and it could just be evaluators being involved in strategic decision making at key points along the way. We've talked about this, I think, a little bit already when Jess spoke about maintaining sort of direction towards specific results, but we think funders and those shaping evaluations at the outset should really be expecting iteration and expecting plans to change. However, expecting also to see a clearly articulated vision of what the impact will be at the end. Third, and we've spoken about this a little bit already, but expecting that while efforts are checking for their impact regularly and pulling together evidence of what is happening as a result of the work, that there's a lot of consideration also for what is happening in the wider system around that impact. And actually, are there unexpected things happening as a result of this that you didn't plan for? Or how has the system changed since you set your impact goals? Fourth, something about retaining evaluations should continue to expect sort of rigorous causal thinking, as just laid out. We have, we've made some suggestions about what that might look like, how that might look different in system work, but nonetheless, there should be that expectation that that's part of the evaluation. However, there also needs to be some sensitivity to emergent outcomes that couldn't have been predicted, that perhaps weren't part of your hypothesis for change. And then finally, we, I guess, wanted to include the idea in our checklist of treating any strategy for system change as a clearly stated hypothesis that you learn about as you go. And we'll speak now, just for the final 5 minutes, we'll speak a little bit about some sort of structure for what that hypothesis might look like in the context of system change work. What kind of outcomes might you be seeking in the context of system change? But yeah, this idea that is always just held as a hypothesis for what you think might happen, and the purpose of your evaluation and system change work is to constantly help you update it. So yeah, I'll hand back to Jess now to speak a little bit about sort of, yeah, what that theory of system change might actually look like based on our experience as practitioners at social finance, but also from what we spoke to folks in the field about.
Thanks, Maddie. So this kind of final offering, I guess, our triangle framework is really, as Maddie said, a kind of way of, it's potentially a helpful way to articulate what those changes might look like and what the impact is that you're seeking. And there are lots of different kind of versions of frameworks out there that you can use for kind of defining your systems change strategy, I guess, and therefore what you're looking for as an evaluator in it. And we've kind of taken bits that we like from our own and from others to combine into 3 elements. So those 3 are sort of, firstly, an articulation of the big kind of end goal that you're seeking to do, how you sort of describing what you want that system change to look like in the long run. That's what we're calling the North Star here. The second thing are kind of a way of a framework to talk about the sort of deep changes in the materials of the system that might need to happen to make to bring about that North Star kind of vision. And the third are kind of an approach to picturing these sort of sizable systems level shifts that are the building blocks that, alongside the changes in the material, bring about that change in the North Star. So the North Star is, I guess, the sort of biggest, broadest articulation of that system change goal and the direction that you're kind of headed towards. And that's when we were talking earlier about the importance of retaining that direction. That's, I suppose, what we would say you'd want to articulate at the beginning and come back to. And that might be expressed in different ways. So it might be kind of very broad brush terms, or it might be more kind of quantifiable. So, you know, you could have something like, the aim is a healthier Costa Rica, or you could have, I want to reduce meat consumption by half in Europe. There's a kind of range of different things, but that's the sort of end goal to which the work is directed. And, you know, it should be linked through hypotheses around in your kind of theory of systems change to the work that you're going to be doing. But we recognize that it might be quite a long, incomplete or complex causal chain. And also that, you know, how you articulate your North Star might kind of become more precise as you go on and you learn along the route what's working, what's not, or actually, you know, what it is that you need to make changes to. The second thing there, so the blue box in the kind of left-hand corner is, we're calling the shifts in the raw materials of the system. And that's, I suppose, changes in the kind of more deep, embedded, implicit patterns. So things like values or beliefs, the kind of culture of the system, the mindsets, how people kind of conceive of it, power changing within the system, shifting from between different groups, or relationships being broken down or created. And for those of you who are familiar with things like FSG's Water of Systems Change or the System Innovation Initiative, who we work with, their 4 keys are really focused on these kind of like deep, the materials of which the system is made, and those things changes, and kind of recognizing that sometimes those might need to be kind of unlocked or loosened in order to enable more, you know, tangible structural shifts to happen, like a new policy to be put into place. And they might also be a place to look for kind of early indicators of change. So actually, are those 2 groups that previously never had anything to do with each other now kind of having conversations and, you know, occasionally meet? Or are people kind of using slightly different words to talk about the issue that you're working on? And is that kind of indicator of something starting to shift in the way that you think it needs to help change happen and kind of make the conditions, put the conditions in place for those shifts? And then in the bottom right corner, the kind of pink one, those are lifted from our Roots to Scale framework that I mentioned at the beginning. And they were our way of trying to kind of articulate some visible, tangible, significant milestones in the sort of road towards global systems change or impact at scale that has a kind of lasting and widespread effect. And kind of when you see these building blocks being put in place, you kind of know there has been a shift of genuine kind of size and a systems level shift, I suppose. But that these are kind of slightly more structural and visible and tangible perhaps than the ones on the left, and perhaps, you know, include things that people may be more kind of familiar with having within their theory of systems change. So whether that's, you know, a new policy or seeing a particular practice or approach or solution being kind of rolled out at scale. And any sort of theory of systems change in the way that we think about it would have these three elements. So you would be thinking about what your North Star is, what the role of the, you know, the change, what raw material changes might need to happen, what building blocks, and they might come in different kind of orders, and not all of them would necessarily be part of every theory of systems change, but they would help you to articulate what you're expecting to see, you know, your best case hypotheses about what sorts of things might need to change. And in turn, those then give your evaluator or your evaluation effort a kind of structure for thinking about what, you know, what they need to seek evidence for. So I guess in a way, what we're trying to do is sort of put some flesh on the bones of what results might look like in a systems change context, and a framework that allows you to think about those that sort of somewhere between the whole system has changed in some way I'm yet able to define, I don't know, to a really kind of detailed theory of systems change for a particular effort, but something that kind of helps to surface some of the things that you might need to look for. And, you know, for those who are more used to kind of classic evaluation context, if you're working with a commissioner or a funder, a sense of what sort of things they could be, you know, looking for in place of having a really kind of tightly defined shorter term evaluation.
I guess one thing just to really quickly add to that is that as we've talked through this with various different audiences, an example that sometimes I think demonstrates what we mean by these three different corners of the triangle is if you think about an effort to reduce consumption of animal products in the UK, which you could say is a system change effort to reduce animal cruelty, or arguably it's a system change a project with a system change mission. You might think of some of the conventional outcomes that you might think of in the North Star bucket might be seeing a reduction in purchasing of animal products or consumption of animal products represented through some quantitative measure. In the blue bucket, in the raw materials, you might see people talking differently about animal products. You might see popular culture or political discourse adding more sort of like moral urgency around the need to shift behavior around animal cruelty. And then you might think in your building blocks of impact in the pink on the right side, you might be thinking about things like new legislation that changes the way animal products are able to advertise themselves, or they might have to perhaps add standards to product labels around how a product has been created. So you might see those legislative tangible changes, you might see the raw materials changes in the way people are talking about it, the relationships between people and the system around it, but then you might also have some quantitative outcomes that are sort of tracking your end goal. And those three things together might be your package of system change impact. That might be your framework that helps you evaluate that system change effort. So I guess we wanted to leave with just a couple of questions for folks listening, or those who are willing to pop some responses to our questions in the chat, or questions of your own. So when we wrote this report, we really did think of it as kind of a point of departure into this space. We hope that we've started to sketch out a bit of a common language for framing different approaches to system change evaluation, and thrown out some sort of challenges and possible responses to those challenges. But we know that there are many out there thinking about this and doing really interesting work on how to evaluate your own system change efforts and those that perhaps you're funding. So I guess we'd be really keen to hear from folks about how much, three things in particular. One, how much room in practice do you think there is to experiment with different evaluation approaches? Where can people be a little bit more bold and do things really differently? And where do folks actually feel like there's not room to do things differently? And similarly, we're keen to hear about examples of really innovative new approaches, and where there's been really effective system change evaluations that have really driven the work forward. So we'll pause there and perhaps hand back to Stuart, who I think has been keeping an eye on any of the questions that have come through while we've been chatting.
Yep, great. Thanks so much. I mean, I'm astounded at how you've managed to get so much onto so few slides. It's really, really useful sort of visual collection of things that's going on there, and I think that really helps to sort of bring a lot of the stuff into place. So we've had a question from Ajay fairly early on, who's asking about the changes that are needed in order to take this more multi-dimensional sort of view of what's happening with so sort of putting together, as you did on that diagram there. And I think he asked before you'd shown that diagram of having there's the two sides that are feeding into the North Star. But sort of so I suppose that question then becomes what do we really need to change? You know, is evaluation practices have to change? Do we need different skills? Are we going to have to change our sort of capabilities and capacity? What about stakeholder management? Is this something that has to change? So what would you say were a few of the key aspects that you're expecting are going to have to be different from our sort of conventional world of evaluation, really, in order to make this focus, particularly on process, being lifted up rather than a sort of humdrum? You know, I think it's sometimes the sort of poor relation in evaluation compared to impact evaluation and the focus on what you're trying to achieve. But here you've promoted it quite a lot. So what's going to need to change?
Do you want to kick off, Madeline?
Yeah, I'll throw one thought in, but this is just the first thing that came to mind. It's not, I won't try to answer it comprehensively, but I think one thing in particular that we've reflected on is that often I think evaluations are commissioned as sort of like a line in the budget for a program. You know, often it's about 10% of the value of the total program. It's commissioned as sort of this standard thing. And sometimes I think there's an expectation that you commission it, and then 3 years later, you'll see the findings. Or, you know, whenever the report is released, you'll then consider the evaluation. And I think if there's one really big thing that we think probably will need to look different in practice, it will be the expectation that there's a set and forget attitude there towards the findings. And I think we'd expect that both those commissioning the evaluation and funding the work will need to be a little bit more involved in understanding what that evaluation is telling them. But perhaps also evaluators themselves and practitioners might need to be sort of thinking a little bit more about how can we be live learning so that we're actually changing the direction of travel as we go, rather than sort of putting pens down 3 years down the line to think about what next. And so I guess that requires potentially quite a different way of working with evaluators. And yeah, maybe I'll pause there, but I think that's probably a big one.
And I would add to that, I think, I mean, that point around kind of, as you're saying, Stuart, the process evaluation and that kind of learning not being the poor cousin. I think we're seeing it kind of growing interest in people talking about learning and kind of seeking learning partners and trying to reach for something in that space. And I think that's really positive. And one of the other reflections, I guess, is social finance. And for those who might know a bit more about our work, we're kind of very well known for kicking off with developing the idea of social impact bonds, which are very much focused on sort of outcomes and focusing on outcomes rather than outputs, which I know, AJ, you mentioned in your question. And what we've found is that where you kind of have higher levels of accountability for outcomes and structures that, you know, incentivize actors around the table to be really kind of keeping a live eye on whether those outcomes are happening and whether things are kind of going in the right direction, actually you elevate that sort of iterative learning process because people want to, you know, change it and make kind of course correct live because they're incentivized to do so. So sometimes there's a kind of interesting connection with a focus on, you can use the focus on impact and outcomes to kind of leverage in more of the focus on that iterative kind of process. And the other thing I think we saw that was interesting was, you know, different sectors facing different challenges. And I think, you know, when we were talking to folks in the international development sector, they felt like they were still trying to fight the battle of moving from outputs to outcomes, and, you know, then the kind of systems things being next on the list. So just to recognize that we know that different sectors also come with different kind of constraints and challenges and probably different changes that need to happen.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. The idea of having the in-flight evaluation stuff going on just changes everybody's perspectives on what's important when and how it all builds up to, you know, your sort of final judgment, as it were. People start to realize that that's not what it's all about, because when you're doing the in-flight, even if it's not a particularly adaptive program, I think that the sort of discipline of having the in-flight thing can be really interesting. But as you say, also it's very much horses for courses, and you find yourself fighting one battle one day, and then, you know, the next day you wake up to find out you're actually trying to persuade people to do almost entirely the opposite of what you were on day one. So that's just, we know that's like, just to say, Marine asked a question about where the publication was, so I've posted that, but to the answer to a different question because I accidentally clicked on the wrong button. But everybody should be able to find that in the answered box. But we'll also put that up on the website. And I'm not sure if it went around in the initial invitation email, but I'm sure that Gail will be able to send something around in the email that goes around to mop up these things. But you'll definitely find it on the website. It's there in the answered questions box, but just in the wrong question. I got a question here from Marcus, which is really interesting, and we've tackled. I've had this question various times, particularly in terms of doing value for money analysis as well in these scenarios. Which is, well, we always say, and you said it in one of the slides, you've got to get in there early. You've got to be involved in the strategic planning stages. You've got to be doing your evaluation there. And one of the reasons for doing that is because you want to set up the right measurements and make sure you're going out to the right places to look for the things you should be looking for. But what do we do if this system's changing before our very eyes? And Marcus's question is a really good one. How do we know what it is we're going to measure when we don't really know where it is that the system's going to be taking us? I think a little bit of that is answered in your focus on process. And when we talk about adaptation, we talk, for example, about measuring, is the system set up to be adaptive, rather than asking, what exactly is it adapting to? But have you got any more clues to answer Marcus's question about what on earth are we going to think we should be measuring when we don't know what it is that the system's going to turn into and how it's going to do things?
I think two thoughts from me on that. So one, it picks up, Marcus, we were actually debating whether or not to kind of touch on this in our presentation around one of the kind of live debates we had often with our partners in the System Innovation Initiative was kind of around this question of, if you're, it was the 3 horizons thing, if you're thinking about this complete system shift, you have no idea what the world's going to look like in this new purported system, how can you be starting to think about evaluating it and, setting up, as you say, Stuart, in this one? And I guess there, I think we recognize that, well, one, there might be sort of points of time in a systems change effort where that kind of complete openness is just the order of the day, and you're starting with a kind of blank piece of paper and you don't quite know, and you're not yet defining what you're going to measure. And that might be right at the very start, where actually part of the work you need to do initially is just to learn about the system and what needs to change within the system. And then as you kind of, that crispens, you then have a clearer idea of, within our triangle, actually what are the things you're looking for, and therefore what might you be measuring off the back of it. And the other thing I think is probably sort of what roles at what point. So actually the entrepreneur who might just be following their hunch and kind of say something's got to change here, and the world's got to look different, but I don't know how. That's perfectly fine, and that is their role. But the evaluator is the kind of critical mindset who has to come in and say, okay, well, you say you don't know, but do you have a sense of at least sort of what sort of change it might be, or what kind of direction, and kind of over time to eke that out. So I think there are kind of both a time thing and a role thing about where you get kind of more crispness about what it might be you're setting out to measure. And then the second bit, I guess, would be, as you sort of intimated, Stuart, that we would say it's something that kind of grows and develops as you go along. So at the beginning, you might just have your North Star and say, I just want a healthier Costa Rica. I don't know how, I don't know what it's going to look like. And actually that kind of process of strategy development and kind of, possibly experiments where you learn that, in fact, it's not acute healthcare you need to focus on, it's community health workers or whatever. As you discover those things, you become clear about what it is you want to do, and hence what you want to measure. But I don't know, Maddie, you might have other thoughts to add to that.
I think, just to emphasize that probably we'd say, the role of the evaluator is to, usually if there's no North Star, then perhaps the work of the evaluator is to define what it is, and that, it could be healthy Costa Rica, it could be, where we care about creating a more vegan, less like animal cruelty. We want to reduce animal cruelty in the UK. And that probably does actually have some metrics. You might be very far off achieving them. You might not think anything I do in the next 5 years is going to reduce that, but that's our goal. And then, that the raw materials that you want to shift, you might not know yet. The building blocks you want to achieve, you might not know yet. Whatever else is there. It's okay not to know that. And I guess I'd also throw back to the example of the cancer lab, where you want to cure cancer, but you just exactly what you're measuring might depend on your hypothesis for what's most likely to be the cure right now. If you're doing cancer vaccines, that will be a very different set of outcome metrics, as it were, or interim metrics, than if you've got another hypothesis about what actually the cure is. And so being just comfortable with that willingness, I suppose, to completely change course based on what you learn.
Yeah, we've got to live with the mystery to a certain extent. As evaluators, we have to become adaptive, I think, don't we, as well? and we have to persuade people that that's the best way of doing it. I think that's partly the trick, isn't it? Because they're so used to it as evaluators being, as you said, the sort of, the strict voice of reason and science in the room. Well, we still are, but we're doing it in a different way, and I think that's a really important thing, and a great note to end on, actually. Apart from me thanking you, we like to end these on time because we know everybody's got busy days, and so we end on time. Apologies to those whose questions haven't been covered. I hope that you'll join another webinar and maybe get to the top of the list next time. Thanks so much, Maddie and Jess, for presenting this, and thanks so much again for your publication, which again, as seeing the slides reminds me of so many things that are really just practically useful to do in every day, and just reminding ourselves of what it is that we're doing and how we're going to communicate that to other people. Absolutely indispensable. So thanks so much, and thank you to everybody for attending, and look out for the follow-up on the website, and please do join another webinar in future. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.